This week on the agenda, who will run the UN? I'll be speaking to 3 of the candidates who hope to be the next Secretary General of the United Nations. Antonio Gutteres will step down as UN Secretary General at the end of this year. With wars raging, trade tensions rising and the climate crisis deepening, who will take up the mantle of trying to solve the world's most pressing problems? Let's take a look at the candidates. First off, Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile and a previous UN human rights chief. Her vision, a more agile and accountable UN built around collective leadership, prevention and respect for human rights. Maria Fernanda Espinosa is a former UN General Assembly president and has also served as Ecuador's foreign minister. She says the UN must be reformed to restore trust and close the gap between its promises and delivery. Argentina's Rafael Grossi currently heads the International Atomic Energy Agency. His vision is for a UN that works, one that acts earlier, uses diplomacy more effectively, and delivers practical solutions to global crises. Costa Rica's Rebeca Grynspan is the UN's current Secretary General of Trade and Development. She's promising a more focused and efficient UN that rebuilds trust and strengthens its ability to prevent conflict. Caroline Rodriguez-Burkett is Guyana's ambassador to the UN. She's also a former foreign minister. Her vision is for the UN to take a people-centered approach to peace, development, and human rights. Macky Sall is the former president of Senegal and also served as chair of the African Union. Sall wants to rebuild multilateralism and make global institutions more inclusive and responsive to the developing world. And last but not least, Ugandan diplomat Olara Otunu, who is a former UN Under-Secretary General and a Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. He's promised to establish a body to oversee UN work on AI and highlighted the need for climate change action that doesn't undermine economic development. I've been fortunate enough to sit down with 3 of those candidates. So first, let's hear from a former president of the UN General Assembly, Ecuador's Maria Fernanda Espinosa. First, I would like to ask you, how do you describe the world we are living in right now?
I think that we are living a world that is polarized, a world that is fragmented, a world in crisis. We're seeing the highest number of armed conflicts since the Second World War. We have numbers that should not make us feel well in the international community. 700 million people without access to electricity, 2.2 billion people without access to safe water. This connection between the climate crisis, displacement, conflict, and conflicts have become more regionalized, more complex. But at the same time, what we see is the configuration of a new multipolar world where innovation, creative ideas on how to tackle the major challenges of our time are appearing. International cooperation is seen as absolutely needed these days, especially among young people. They feel international cooperation and solidarity continue to be fundamental as we build a world with less inequalities and working together to ensure that people live free from fear and free from want. That is precisely what the UN was created for, to prevent wars and to protect people, which means that the UN, in spite of this world in crisis, continues to be necessary, continues to be relevant and important. The challenge we have is to make the UN better and to make the UN relevant for all.
Exactly. And you said the problem or the challenge the UN is facing right now is not about its relevance, it's about its credibility. And what would you do to restore its credibility?
Credibility cannot be proclaimed. It has to be earned. And the way to earn credibility is about impact and effectiveness, and ensuring that people on the ground feel that they are being served and listened to, and where people in need or in situations of conflict, they feel the UN is there for them. And the general public, opinion makers, understand that the UN is irreplaceable, that the UN is there to stay, and the UN is efficient, the UN is impact-driven and not process-driven, that the UN is not this huge, big machinery, but is a lean, modern, effective organization. And I think it also, the issue of credibility is about ensuring that the UN is transformed in a platform where we can embrace diversity in different perspectives and positions within unity of purpose. And the unity of purpose comes from the constitution of the UN, which is the UN Charter. That is the unity of purpose. And I think that we should not be afraid of dissent, of having difference of opinions. As president of the General Assembly, that was my job, to be an honest broker, to be seen as impartial, to be seen as a person that has an open door policy and that speaks to every state, big or small, big power or not, but really brings the sense of trust to the House. Unfortunately, I see that today, inside the walls of the United Nations, we need to reboost trust and the ability to process dissent and to talk to each other, even if they don't agree. And the role of the Secretary General there is extremely important.
And also it's quite challenging, isn't it? Especially if you want to uphold multilateralism, or if you want to navigate the differences among the major powers, the P5, or some say the P3. How would you do that?
I have to say that's my job description as president of the General Assembly. No, to be seen, because I cannot self-proclaim, but to be seen as an honest broker, as impartial, as entering a room without an agenda, and to facilitate a dialogue, to make sure that the ones that oppose each other or disagree with each other feel the trust to process their difference of opinion, sometimes with the use of an honest broker, and that honest broker should be the Secretary General. Sometimes this work is silent. Sometimes the work is backstage work. It doesn't come out in the headlines, but you have to have the ability to do that. And throughout my career, that's what I have done. It's very important that in the next selection of the Secretary General, that quality of being seen as an impartial, honest broker is put at the center. To be a person that is non-aligned, that doesn't have an agenda, and it's friends with everyone, no, and doesn't favor anyone, no, and the only impartiality is extremely important.
My impression is you believe you should assist, not intervene.
Absolutely. In some circumstances, the UN should intervene.
Yeah.
In other circumstances, the UN should act. No, that's why I'm proposing to establish this very small, highly efficient prevention and early action hub. No, to make sure the UN deploys its capacity to prevent conflict. That's what the UN Charter says. Unfortunately, we have seen the UN arrive too little, too late. And the personal engagement of a Secretary General is of utmost importance, to have the energy to be here and there and where the Secretary General is needed, and to make yourself available and be persistent. Sometimes the UN needs to be center stage and take the lead. In other circumstances and contexts, the UN has to provide a supporting role. And the UN is irreplaceable in some of the work it needs to do. For example, the humanitarian work of the UN. I don't think that any other organization in the world can do what the UN does. And here in my head, 350 people that humanitarian workers that lost their lives in the past 2 years. No, it means that is a work of sacrifice, but where the UN has an enormous comparative advantage. So it's not one size fits all. The organization has to adapt, and the leadership of the UN has to adapt to be demand-driven and not supply-driven.
I would also want to talk about multilateralism with you. Do you think it has been undermined increasingly?
I think that multilateralism, the translation of that is international cooperation. Multilateralism is a very difficult word to pronounce sometimes. But we live in a multipolar world. We live in a world where regional configurations are extremely important and powerful. They take their own decisions. They are part of the international community. You have countries that have decided that they want to have an active role on mediation of conflicts. We see now the case of Pakistan, for example, with the support of China in the war in Iran these days. You have other countries that have decided, like Qatar or the UAE, they have taken the issue of mediation as a very important issue of their foreign policy. So the UN has to provide this supporting role. These are new ways of multilateralism. No, again, the regional hubs. Let's speak about ASEAN or the African Union or CELAC in my own region of Latin America and the Caribbean. They have a very important role to play. Financially speaking, the multilateral banks, we used to think that the Bretton Woods was everything. But now we have strong regional banks emerging. We have the initiatives that China has put forward that are extremely important and that strengthen multilateralism. No, the Global Governance Initiative, for example, the connectivity, the Global Economic Initiative, really puts China as one of the leaders that fully trusts the mechanisms for cooperation, for solidarity, and for a new form of multilateralism. So unfortunately, we have to accept that. The UN is not the only game in town right now, but it is the most important. It is the universal platform. That's why it is irreplaceable. It is so needed, and that's why we need to reform it and make it better.
Maria Fernanda Espinosa there. Now to one of the three men in the running to replace Antonio Gutteres, Argentina's Rafael Grossi, who currently heads the International Atomic Energy Agency. How do you describe the world we are living in right now?
Well, I think on the diagnostic of the world, I think there is general agreement that it is a world mired in conflict, where interstate war has returned, with inequalities, crisis of a global nature. So a generally complex agenda and scenario that I think compels us to try to put to the best use the instruments we have to deal or try to deal with them, including the United Nations.
And what do you think is the role of the UN now?
The role of the UN is clear. The thing is whether it is fulfilling the role, and I think it is not. For a number of circumstances. It's not a particular person or country responsibility, but the reality is that when you look at today's international peace and security agenda, as I was saying, with wars in Europe, wars in Africa, in some parts of Asia as well, with conflict, Middle East, etc., we can see that there is a common denominator, which is very, I would say, disappointing. And this is that the United Nations is absent from the resolution of all of these conflicts. So I think there is a big gap there that needs to be fulfilled. The same, to a certain extent, can apply to the development agenda, where in spite of the agreements that we as an international community found a few years ago through the Sustainable Development Goals, when it comes to the rate of attainment of all these goals, we see that the figures are very disappointing, very dismaying. 15, 18, 20%, I don't know. Observers and analysts diverge on the exact figure, but it is clear that we are far from where we would like to be. So then again, the question comes to mind as to how does the UN or how can it contribute what it is not doing in the right way? Because there is no doubt that among the pillars of the UN work, the development one is the biggest one, is the one that concentrates more than 2/3 of the resources that are channeled to the UN, and also the biggest in terms of organizations and bureaucratic structures to deal with it. So I think that for the next Secretary General, one of the important priorities will be to dispassionately look at how the development pillar is being looked at and what should be improved. The same can apply to human rights or to the humanitarian function, which, by the way, is important and is fulfilling, at least partially, some of what is expected from it. But let's be reminded that when we need so much humanitarian is because we are failing in everything else, in preventing diplomacy, in restoring peace, in ensuring development and dignified conditions for the peoples of the world. It's a tall order for the UN these times, and in particular for the Secretary General.
It is a tall order for the Secretary General, and you think it's disappointing, and also mainly because there is a gap between promise and delivery. And you said in your campaign message that the UN needs to become more effective and results-driven. If you were the Secretary General, what would be the first reform you would do?
Well, there I would say, instead of, if I can change a word in your question, if you allow me to do that, what would be the first thing that you would do? Not reform. Reform is indispensable.
You don't want anything too drastic?
Perhaps what is drastically needed is the involvement of the Secretary General and the contribution of the Secretary General in the pursuit of international peace and security. And with me as Secretary General, as it happens now at the International Atomic Energy Agency, you will see a Secretary General that is out in the field, in the places where the conflicts take place, like I am in the front line between Russia and Ukraine, or when problems arise between Japan and China for the Fukushima water. I am there on a boat checking out, or in the Middle East, in Iran, in Syria, in Iraq, where you need to be, not in New York necessarily. So I would say you need a hands-on Secretary General.
Let's say if you were elected as the next Secretary General next year, and you are facing some wars in the Middle East, in Europe, and also in Africa, and on top of that, we're looking at climate change, hunger, economic downturn. You have to be personally engaged with everything, but what are your priorities? Maybe just give me one or two.
I think it is, in abstract, the priorities of the day are the priorities of the day. And today it is not that day. But when we look at the international agenda, one must know what requires the urgent intervention of the Secretary General. If we are seeing a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in front of our very eyes in the Middle East, then the SG has to get involved. If we see a military conflict about to break out or breaking out, then that will be the priority. So I believe that putting, like, I don't want to say artificial, but, preordained things, it is not a good idea. I think every day will be a battle.
And I also want to talk about the voice of the developing countries.
Yeah.
What would you do to make sure that their voices can be heard?
Well, as I was saying, the development pillar is so important for them. But we have to know that we need to act differently, perhaps. Continuing to do the same might not yield better results than the ones that we have had until now. Look at the Sustainable Development Goals. What is the rate of attainment? 20%, 15%, and 2030 is the day after tomorrow. So quite clearly, we have to have the clear-mindedness and honesty to understand that we need to make adjustments. Mm-hmm. And that we need to work differently maybe with countries, with the international finance institutions, mm-hmm. which are so important, with the private sector, with foundations, with countries. It is essential to be more focused.
And let's hear from another of those in the running to take over the top job at the United Nations when Antonio Gutteres steps down at the end of this year. Rebeca, Grynspan, who is the UN's current Secretary General of Trade and Development. First of all, how would you describe the world we're living in right now?
Well, this is a complex world. We are in a crossroad. First of all, I always say multipolarity is not a choice, it's a fact. We are in a multipolar world. What is a choice is multilateralism. Are we going to have multipolarity with multilateralism or without? Mm-hmm. Without, it will lead us to fragmentation. We are in a world of contradictions and of change, and very accelerated change. And when change is so fast, not everything changes at the same pace. So there are new disequilibriums in the world. There are new imbalances and asymmetries that we need collectively to solve for a more stable and more peaceful world. We have to agree again that having international institutions that will be able to solve problems that no one of us can solve alone is the right way to go.
I think if we want to agree again, at the end of the day, it's all about trust, isn't it? And you said that across the world, trust in the UN is waning. What would you do to restore trust? Now, how long do you think that would take?
Well, I really believe that trust is something that is not easy to build and is very easy to destroy. And that the Secretary General of the UN can play an important role in building trust. And that is about engagement. It's about creating spaces for dialogue. It's about, let me say it this way, not surprising you. Yes? You know what I will do. You know that I will hold. I can be hold to my word. You know that I will be transparent. You know that I will be independent and impartial. Those are the elements, the indispensable elements to build trust. You have to have integrity, perseverance, and the impartiality to really hold the UN towards the objectives and challenges that we have set for the UN to solve.
You also said we shouldn't do more with less. We should do less with less. If you are the next Secretary General, what change, what reform even would you make?
I think that phrase has been misunderstood, like shrinking the UN. No, less with less means to be more strategic. So what I believe is that the UN has to be more strategic with less. Refocus. Do the things where the UN is unique and partner with others in the things that others can do. Well, in peace and security, I said that I will reform the office of the Secretary General. I think that the Secretary General has to have a group in the office of the Secretary General that can move with flexibility, with urgency, fast, with creativity. And that will be necessary for preventive diplomacy and mediation. Mm-hmm. and I believe in both. In development, I think that there is duplication and unhealthy competition within many parts of the UN. And there, I think that we need more discipline. We cannot all follow the money. We have to agree which are the organizations that have the capacity to do certain things, and not to try to duplicate that capacity just to have the money in another organization. So more discipline has to be exerted. And I think that the reform is about convincing. I think that at the top there are still things to be done, yes, in terms of too many top positions that maybe should be looked at. And the process of UNAID that has happened until now, where a lot of effort has gone into, have to be taken seriously. I want to see what will be the recommendations and take decisions.
What would you do to uphold multilateralism under the framework of the United Nations, given that we have seen that some countries now are bypassing the UN already?
Well, I will tell you this. The UN has never had the monopoly of everything. We haven't had the monopoly of peace and security. We haven't had the monopoly of development. And we haven't had the monopoly of human rights and human dignity. But we are a moral center and a legitimate place to hold to those principles. In my conversations with most of the countries of the world, I can tell you they want the multilateral system to hold. The small and medium-sized countries don't have the luxury of isolation. Our interdependence comes from our resilience comes from our interdependence. We need the system. We need the multilateral system. We need the agreed rules world. And we will fight for it. And I really believe that most of the countries of the world want the multilateral system to hold. You know, the law of the jungle is not good for anybody.
But do you think we're going back to the law of the jungle?
No, I think that it depends on us. I refuse this fatalism. I refuse this idea that there is nothing to be done. Because precisely that is what takes away our agency, our capacity to choose, our capacity to do good. And the world has demonstrated many times that we can avoid the worst, and we have to.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up on a future agenda, a continent on fire. What do the wildfires sweeping Europe tell us about the changing climate? But for now, from me, Jianhua, and the whole Agenda team here in London, that's goodbye.